The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of old books and fresh ink, a scent that always made Eleanor Carter feel both nervous and hopeful. Today was different, though. Today wasn't just another day at work, it was personal. Clutching her folder tightly against her chest, she walked up the marble steps, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the cold surface. She had spent months preparing for this moment, poring over documents late into the night, double-checking every detail to ensure nothing was left to chance. But now, standing in front of those heavy oak doors, doubt crept into her mind like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor wasn't a lawyer. She worked as a paralegal at a small firm downtown. Her job usually involved assisting attorneys with research and paperwork, not arguing cases in court. Yet here she was, about to represent herself in a civil dispute over an unpaid debt. It wasn't even a large sum, just $5,000, but it mattered deeply to her. The money had been taken from her account without permission by a company claiming she owed them for services she never received. When she tried to contest it, they ignored her letters and calls, brushing her off like she didn't exist. So, after exhausting all other options, she decided to take matters into her own hands. As she entered the courtroom, the buzz of conversation quieted slightly. People glanced at her, some curious, others indifferent. Eleanor found her seat near the front and placed her folder on the table, smoothing out the edges unnecessarily. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Around her, the room felt alive with tension. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispering to their clients, or scribbling last-minute notes. A bailiff stood near the door, his presence adding a layer of formality to the scene. And then there was the judge's bench, a towering symbol of authority that seemed almost intimidating in its grandeur. A few minutes later, Judge Richard Holloway strode into the room, his black robes billowing behind him like a cape. He carried himself with an air of superiority, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if sizing everyone up. His reputation preceded him. He was known for being arrogant, impatient, and particularly harsh toward people who represented themselves in court. Many lawyers whispered about how he favored big corporations and wealthy clients, often ruling against ordinary individuals without much consideration. Eleanor had heard the stories but tried not to let them distract her. Still, when he settled into his chair and called the court to order, her stomach twisted into knots. "Next case," Judge Holloway announced in a clipped tone, barely glancing at the docket in front of him. "Carter versus Premier Financial Services." Eleanor stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table for support. She introduced herself clearly, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her body. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel smirked, clearly unimpressed. He was a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, exuding confidence as he leaned back in his chair. For a brief moment, Eleanor wondered if she'd made a mistake coming here alone. But then she reminded herself why she was fighting: for justice, for fairness, and for the principle that no one should be bullied into paying for something they didn't owe. Judge Holloway fixed his gaze on her, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you understand that this is a legal proceeding, correct? Not some amateur debate club?" The comment stung, but Eleanor forced herself to nod politely. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied calmly. "I've prepared thoroughly for today's hearing." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "We'll see about that." With a flick of his wrist, he motioned for her to begin her opening statement. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped forward. She spoke slowly and deliberately, outlining the facts of the case: how the unauthorized withdrawal had occurred, how she had attempted to resolve the issue amicably, and how the company had refused to cooperate. As she talked, she noticed the opposing counsel rolling his eyes and exchanging smirks with his assistant. Even Judge Holloway seemed bored, tapping his pen rhythmically against the desk. It was clear they underestimated her, dismissing her as just another clueless individual trying to play lawyer. But Eleanor wasn't fazed. She had expected resistance, and she was ready for it. What they didn't know was that beneath her quiet exterior lay a sharp intellect honed by years of working in the legal field. She had studied countless cases, memorized statutes, and analyzed precedents until she could recite them in her sleep. This wasn't just about winning a case for her. It was about proving that knowledge and determination could level the playing field, no matter how stacked the odds might seem. As she wrapped up her opening statement, Judge Holloway leaned forward, his lips curling into a sly smile. "Very well, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Let's see if, you can keep up with the professionals." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and loaded with implication. Eleanor met his gaze squarely, her resolve hardening. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. Little did he know, the real battle was just beginning, and Eleanor was more prepared than anyone realized. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, a smug expression plastered across his face. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Eleanor, sizing her up like a predator examining its prey. He wasn't used to people standing their ground, especially not someone like her. Quiet, unassuming, and without a law degree. To him, she was just another self-represented litigant who didn't belong in his courtroom, and he made no effort to hide his disdain. "Well, Ms. Carter," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I assume you've done your homework. But let's see if you can actually keep up with the professionals." His gaze flicked briefly to the opposing counsel, who smirked confidently, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The slick lawyer adjusted his tie and crossed one leg over the other, exuding an air of superiority that grated on Eleanor's nerves. She clenched her jaw but kept her composure, refusing to give either man the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Judge Holloway tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythmic clicking echoing through the otherwise quiet room. "Let's start with something simple," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Can you explain to me and the court the legal basis for your claim? And please try to use terms we can all understand." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. She had anticipated this line of questioning and rehearsed her answer countless times. Opening her folder, she pulled out a neatly organized set of documents and placed them on the table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and measured, "my claim is based on violations of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Specifically, Premier Financial Services withdrew funds from my account without providing proper notice or obtaining my consent. I have evidence showing that these actions were unauthorized and constitute unlawful collection practices." Her words hung in the air for a moment, clear and concise. For a split second, Judge Holloway looked surprised, though he quickly masked it with irritation. He glanced at the opposing counsel, whose smirk faltered slightly before returning full force. Clearly they hadn't expected her to articulate her argument so effectively. "Interesting," Judge Holloway said dryly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But laws aren't always black and white, are they, Ms. Carter? Can you tell me how this particular statute applies to your situation?" He folded his arms across his chest, leaning back in his chair again. His posture screamed arrogance, as if he already knew she wouldn't be able to answer. Eleanor nodded, unfazed by his challenge. She flipped to another page in her folder, revealing a highlighted copy of the relevant statute. "Under Section 806 of the Act," she explained, "debt collectors are prohibited from engaging in unfair or deceptive practices when attempting to collect debts. In this case, Premier Financial Services failed to provide written validation of the alleged debt within the required time frame, which is a direct violation of the law. Furthermore, they initiated a withdrawal from my account without my authorization, which constitutes harassment under subsection 5. The courtroom grew quieter, the murmurs of spectators fading into stunned silence. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her knowledge. Judge Holloway, however, wasn't ready to concede anything. Instead, he leaned forward again, his expression darkening. "You seem to have memorized some key phrases, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice sharp. "But do you really understand what they mean? Or are you just regurgitating information you found online?" The jab stung, but Eleanor refused to let it show. She met his gaze squarely, her brown eyes steady and unwavering. "Your Honor," she replied, her tone respectful yet firm, I may not have a law degree, but I've spent months researching this case. I've reviewed dozens of precedents and consulted multiple resources to ensure my understanding is accurate. If you'd like, I can cite specific cases where similar violations resulted in judgments favoring the plaintiffs. For the first time, since the hearing began, Judge Holloway looked genuinely annoyed. He hadn't expected her to push back so confidently, or to know as much as she did. His irritation only grew when the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly uneasy about the direction things were taking. Up until now, he had assumed this would be an easy win. After all, judges like Holloway rarely sided, with individuals going up against large corporations. But Eleanor was proving to be far more formidable than anyone had anticipated. Determined to regain control of the situation, Judge Holloway pressed harder. "All right, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone mocking. "Let's move on to something a bit more challenging. Can you explain the burden of proof in civil cases? And while you're at it, perhaps you could enlighten us on the difference between preponderance of evidence and beyond a reasonable doubt." It was a loaded question, designed to trip her up and embarrass her in front of the entire courtroom. Most laypeople wouldn't know the distinction, and even some lawyers struggled to explain it succinctly. But Eleanor wasn't most people. She had spent hours studying legal concepts, determined to leave no stone unturned in her preparation. "The burden of proof in civil cases," she began, speaking slowly to emphasize each point, "is based on the preponderance of evidence. This means that the plaintiff must prove their case is more likely true than not, essentially tipping the scales of justice in their favor by even the slightest margin. In contrast, beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard used in criminal cases, requiring a much higher level of certainty before a verdict can be reached." She paused, glancing at the judge to gauge his reaction. His lips were pursed tightly, and his brow furrowed as if he were trying to find fault with her explanation. When he didn't interrupt, she continued, "In this case, Your Honor, I believe the evidence overwhelmingly supports my claim. Not only do I have documentation proving the unauthorized withdrawal, but I also have records showing that Premier Financial Services ignored my requests for validation. Together, these facts establish a clear pattern of misconduct." The courtroom erupted into low murmurs, the spectators exchanging astonished glances. No one had expected Eleanor to hold her own so effectively, let alone outmaneuver a seasoned judge and a corporate attorney. Even the opposing counsel seemed flustered, fumbling with his notes as he tried to come up with a counter-argument. Judge Holloway, meanwhile, looked increasingly frustrated, his earlier confidence wavering. "You certainly talk a good game, Ms. Carter," he said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "But talking isn't enough. Let's see if you can back up your claims with actual evidence." Eleanor allowed herself a small inward smile. She knew this was her moment to shine. Reaching into her folder, she pulled out a stack of bank statements, emails, and correspondence with Premier Financial Services. Each document was meticulously labeled and organized, making it easy for anyone to follow along. As she laid them out on the table, she felt a surge of pride, not just in her preparation, but in the realization that she was holding her own against two powerful adversaries. This is only the beginning, she thought to herself, her resolve stronger than ever. Whatever came next, she was ready. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Eleanor began presenting her evidence. She had spent countless late nights organizing every document, cross-referencing details, and ensuring that her case was airtight. Now, standing before Judge Holloway and the opposing counsel, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about proving her innocence, it was about showing that she couldn't be dismissed so easily. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, "I'd like to submit Exhibit A into evidence." She held up a printed copy of her bank statement, pointing to a specific transaction highlighted in yellow. "This shows an unauthorized withdrawal of $5,000 from my account on March 12th. As you can see, there's no authorization or explanation provided for this charge." Judge Holloway glanced at the document briefly, his expression unreadable. He turned to the opposing counsel, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Grayson," the judge said, addressing the slick lawyer, "does your client dispute this?" Transaction? The lawyer hesitated, flipping through his own stack of papers. Your Honor, he stammered. The withdrawal was initiated as part of a standard debt collection process. Ms. Carter was notified via email prior to the transaction. Eleanor didn't wait for the judge to respond. She quickly interjected, her tone polite but firm. With all due respect, Your Honor, that's not accurate. According to federal law, debt collectors are required to provide written validation of the alleged debt within 5 days of initial contact. I never received any such notice. She handed another document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. It was a timeline she had created, detailing every interaction or lack thereof with Premier Financial Services. The judge scanned the timeline, his brow furrowing slightly. For the first time since the hearing began, he seemed genuinely interested in what Eleanor had to say. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone less condescending than before, can you elaborate on these communications, or lack thereof? Certainly, Your Honor, Eleanor replied, stepping forward confidently. She gestured toward the timeline. As you can see, I sent multiple emails requesting validation of the debt, starting on February 28th. None of those emails were acknowledged. In fact, the only response I received came after the unauthorized withdrawal, when they sent me a generic form letter claiming the debt was valid. However, the letter contained no supporting documentation, which is a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The opposing counsel, Mr. Grayson, tried to interrupt. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Carter is mischaracterizing. Overruled, Judge Holloway snapped, cutting him off. His irritation was evident, though it was unclear whether it was directed at Eleanor or his own growing discomfort with the proceedings. Let her finish, Eleanor continued, undeterred. Furthermore, Your Honor, I have copies of all correspondence exchanged between myself and Premier Financial Services. These emails clearly show that I repeatedly asked for proof of the alleged debt. They ignored my requests entirely, choosing instead to take matters into their own hands by withdrawing funds directly from my account. This constitutes harassment under Section 806 of the Act. She placed the email chain on the table, each message meticulously labeled and dated. The gallery murmured softly, spectators leaning forward to get a better look. Even the bailiff seemed intrigued, glancing down at the documents as he handed them to the judge. Eleanor could feel the momentum shifting in her favor, and she pressed on, determined to drive her point home. But it doesn't end there, Your Honor, she said, her voice rising slightly with conviction. In addition to violating federal law, Premier Financial Services has engaged in deceptive practices. For example, they claimed I owed money for services rendered, yet they failed to specify what those services were or provide any invoices to substantiate their claim. Without proper documentation, how can they justify taking my money? At this point, Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his earlier smugness replaced by a mixture of frustration and curiosity. He turned to Mr. Grayson, who looked increasingly flustered. Counselor, the judge said sharply, do you have anything to refute Ms. Carter's allegations? Mr. Grayson fumbled with his notes, clearly unprepared for Eleanor's thorough presentation. Your Honor, he began, sweat forming on his forehead. My client maintains that the debt is legitimate. However, we may need additional time to review the evidence presented here today. Additional time? Judge Holloway repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. This isn't recess, it's a courtroom. If your client can't produce documentation now, perhaps they shouldn't have pursued legal action in the first place. Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had known this would happen. Their entire case rested on intimidation tactics and vague claims. When pushed for specifics, they crumbled. But she wasn't done yet. There was one final piece of evidence she had been saving for this exact moment. Your Honor, she said, drawing everyone's attention back to her. There's something else I'd like to bring to the court's attention. During my research, I discovered a disturbing pattern involving Premier Financial Services. And, unfortunately, it appears to extend beyond my individual case. The room fell silent. Even Judge Holloway sat up straighter, his interest piqued. Eleanor reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound together with a rubber band. These are public records, she explained, holding them up for emphasis. They show that Premier Financial Services has been involved in numerous lawsuits over the past 5 years, many of which involve similar allegations of unauthorized withdrawals and failure to validate debts. In several instances, courts ruled against them, citing violations of consumer protection laws. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. Then, with deliberate care, she added, "But what concerns me most, Your Honor, is the connection between these cases and certain judicial rulings. Specifically, I found that Judge Holloway presided over 3 of these cases, and in each instance, he ruled in favor of Premier Financial Services, often citing questionable interpretations of the law." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Spectators exchanged shocked glances while reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Judge Holloway's face turned an alarming shade of red, his composure slipping for the first time. "Ms. Carter," he barked, slamming his gavel down hard enough to make the wood crack. "You're treading dangerously close to contempt of court." "I'm simply presenting facts, Your Honor," Eleanor replied calmly, unfazed by his outburst. "If there's a pattern of misconduct involving both Premier Financial Services and members of the judiciary, shouldn't it be investigated? After all, justice must be transparent and impartial." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Judge Holloway stared at her, his eyes blazing with anger, but also perhaps a hint of fear. He knew as well as anyone in the room that Eleanor had struck a nerve. Whether intentional or not, she had exposed a potential scandal that could jeopardize his career. Forcing himself to regain control, Judge Holloway cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Enough of this," he growled, his voice strained. "We'll adjourn for 15 minutes. Counselors, meet me in chambers immediately." As the bailiff called for a recess, Eleanor returned to her seat, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and triumph. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but she knew she had made her point. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. She had proven that even the quietest voices could demand accountability and win. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as the 15-minute recess dragged on far longer than expected. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening behind closed doors in Judge Holloway's chambers. Reporters huddled near the exit, scribbling notes and debating whether this case might blow up into something bigger, a scandal that could make headlines for weeks. Eleanor sat quietly at her table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside her mind raced. She replayed every word she had said, analyzing whether she had pushed too far or if she had struck just the right balance. When the doors finally opened and Judge Holloway reemerged, his face was unreadable, neither angry nor calm, but somewhere, unsettlingly in between. His usual arrogance seemed muted, replaced by a tension that made him appear smaller somehow. He took his seat, adjusted his robes, and called the court back to order. The opposing counsel, Mr. Grayson, looked pale and disheveled, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. "Ms. Carter," Judge Holloway began, his voice clipped and measured, "you've raised some serious allegations today." He paused, glancing down at the documents spread across his desk. "However, I must remind you that accusations of misconduct, especially those involving members of the judiciary, are not to be made lightly. Do you have any evidence to substantiate your claims?" Eleanor stood slowly, steadying herself before responding. This was the moment she had prepared for, the one where she would reveal the final piece of her carefully constructed puzzle. Taking a deep breath, she reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound together with a paperclip. Each page was meticulously labeled, complete with dates, case numbers, and highlighted excerpts from court transcripts. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful but unwavering. "These are public records obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. They include rulings from 3 separate cases presided over by you, all involving Premier Financial Services as the plaintiff. In each instance, the company was accused of engaging in predatory debt collection practices similar to those alleged in my case. Despite substantial evidence presented by the defendants, including documentation of unauthorized withdrawals and failure to validate debts. You ruled in favor of Premier Financial Services." She paused, letting her words sink in. The gallery leaned forward collectively, hanging on every syllable. Even the bailiff, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, glanced at the judge with a flicker of curiosity. "To be clear, Your Honor," Eleanor continued, "I'm not suggesting that these rulings were improper simply because they went against the defendants. What concerns me, and what should concern everyone here, is the consistency of the pattern. In each case, your decisions relied on interpretations of the law that other courts have since rejected. Moreover, 2 of these cases were later overturned on appeal, with higher courts citing fundamental errors in legal reasoning." Judge Holloway's jaw tightened visibly, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench so hard that his knuckles turned white. Other lawyers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They'd seen this behavior before. The opposing counsel, a slick lawyer hired by a predatory lender, smirks confidently, knowing the judge will side with him. Eleanor remains calm, her hands steady as she flips through her notes. Despite the growing tension, she doesn't raise her voice or show frustration, which only seems to irritate Judge Holloway further. Part 3. The turning point as the hearing progresses. Judge Holloway pushes harder, trying to rattle Eleanor into submission. He demands she explain complex legal precedents on the spot, mocking her lack of formal legal training and implying that someone like her has no place in his courtroom. To everyone's surprise, including her opponent, Eleanor calmly cites case law verbatim, referencing statutes and prior rulings with precision. The room falls silent as she dismantles the lender's argument piece by piece, exposing inconsistencies in their documentation. Even Judge Holloway looks momentarily stunned, though he quickly masks it with irritation. For the first time, Eleanor allows herself a faint smile, sensing she's gaining the upper hand. Part 4. Exposing corruption, Eleanor's confidence grows as she presents additional evidence. An email chain showing collusion between the lender and another party involved in the case. What shocks the courtroom most, however, is when she reveals a pattern of misconduct involving Judge Holloway himself. Through painstaking research, Eleanor uncovered documents suggesting the judge had previously ruled in favor of the same lender in similar cases, often citing dubious interpretations of the law. The revelation sends murmurs rippling through the gallery. Judge Holloway's face turns red, and he tries to shut her down, accusing her of slander. But Eleanor remains composed, reminding him that the truth is protected under the First Amendment. Part 5. Justice prevails. The atmosphere in the EOD courtroom shifts dramatically as Eleanor concludes her presentation. The opposing counsel stammers through a weak rebuttal, clearly shaken by the unexpected turn of events. Judge Holloway, realizing his position is precarious, reluctantly rules in Eleanor's favor, dismissing the case against her. Though he attempts to save face with a curt warning about respecting authority, his words ring hollow. Outside the courthouse, reporters who were tipped off by Eleanor's meticulous planning swarm her for interviews. Word spreads quickly about the quiet woman who outsmarted both a corrupt judge and a powerful corporation. Part 6. A new chapter in. The weeks following the trial, Eleanor becomes something of a local hero. Encouraged by the public support, she decides to pursue her dream of becoming a lawyer, enrolling in night classes while continuing her work as a paralegal. Meanwhile, investigations into Judge Holloway's conduct intensify, eventually leading to his suspension and criminal charges. The scandal rocks the legal community, sparking calls for greater accountability within the judiciary. Though Eleanor never sought fame, she embraces her newfound role as an advocate for justice, determined to use her skills to help others navigate the system. In doing so, she proves that Brilliance and Integrine. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Eleanor finished presenting her evidence. Every eye in the room was fixed on Judge Holloway, waiting to see how he would respond. He sat motionless for a moment, his face pale and his jaw clenched tightly. The weight of Eleanor's accusations hung heavy in the air, like storm clouds threatening to burst. For the first time that day, the judge looked less like an untouchable authority figure and more like a man backed into a corner. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Holloway cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, almost subdued. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone strained but deliberate, "you've presented compelling information. However, this court cannot render judgment based solely on allegations, no matter how well documented they may appear." Eleanor nodded calmly, knowing full well that she had already planted seeds of doubt, not just in the minds of those present but potentially in the broader public consciousness. She didn't need him to admit guilt outright. She only needed to expose the cracks in his facade. Still, she wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady and respectful, "I understand that these matters require further investigation, but I must emphasize that my case against Premier Financial Services stands independently of these revelations. Regardless of any connections or patterns involving your past rulings, the facts remain clear. They withdrew funds from my account without proper authorization, ignored my requests for validation, and violated federal consumer protection laws. My evidence proves this beyond question." Her words landed like hammer strikes, each one driving home the undeniable truth. Across the aisle, Mr. Grayson, the opposing counsel, looked utterly defeated. His earlier confidence had vanished entirely, replaced by a nervous twitch in his left eye. He fumbled with his papers, trying desperately to find something, anything, to salvage the situation. But there was nothing left to say. Eleanor had dismantled their arguments piece by piece, leaving them with no ground to stand on. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. He glanced at Mr. Grayson, then at the stack of documents on his desk, before finally turning his attention back to Eleanor. "Very well, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "Given the evidence you've presented and the lack of credible rebuttal from the opposing party, I have no choice but to rule in your favor. The case is dismissed." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Spectators exchanged astonished looks, some whispering excitedly while others simply stared in disbelief. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the outcome. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to feel a flicker of triumph. She had done it. Against all odds, she had taken on a corrupt system and won. But she wasn't done yet. Before the judge could bang his gavel and officially close the hearing, Eleanor spoke up again. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her tone polite but firm. "However, I'd like to make one final statement, if I may." Judge Holloway hesitated, his expression wary. After everything that had transpired, he likely feared what she might say next. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Proceed, Ms. Carter." Standing tall, Eleanor addressed the entire courtroom. "Today isn't just about me," she began, her voice carrying a quiet strength that commanded attention. "It's about every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Companies like Premier Financial Services prey on ordinary people because they think we won't fight back. Judges like—" She paused briefly, glancing at Judge Holloway. "Well, judges are supposed to protect us from such abuses. When that trust is broken, it undermines the very foundation of our legal system." She paused again, letting her words resonate. Then, with a deep breath, she continued, "I didn't come here seeking revenge or personal glory. I came here because I believe in fairness. I believe in accountability. And I hope that today's ruling sends a message not just to Premier Financial Services, but to anyone who thinks they can exploit others without consequence." When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Spectators clapped enthusiastically, some even rising to their feet. Reporters scrambled to jot down quotes, while camera flashes illuminated the space like lightning strikes. Judge Holloway banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but his commands were drowned out by the swell of support for Eleanor. Outside the courthouse, chaos ensued. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by rumors of the dramatic showdown inside. As Eleanor stepped out onto the marble steps, blinking in the bright sunlight, She was immediately surrounded by reporters shoving microphones in her face and shouting questions. How does it feel to win against such a powerful opponent? What made you decide to represent yourself? Do you think Judge Holloway will face consequences for his actions? Eleanor held up a hand, signaling for silence. When the noise subsided slightly, she smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile, and spoke directly to the cameras. This victory belongs to everyone who refuses to stay silent when faced with injustice. If there's one thing I want people to take away from today, it's this. Never underestimate the power of preparation, persistence, and believing in yourself. No matter how intimidating the system may seem, you have the right to stand up and demand fairness. Her words struck a chord resonating far beyond the courthouse steps. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Eleanor's David versus Goliath tale across the city, and eventually, the nation. Social media exploded with praise for her courage and determination. Hashtags like "Geese Justice for Eleanor" and "Stand Up to Corruption" trended online, sparking conversations about accountability in the legal system. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the fallout continued. Judge Holloway found himself under intense scrutiny, with calls for an ethics investigation growing louder by the hour. Lawmakers cited Eleanor's case as evidence of systemic issues within the judiciary, demanding reforms to prevent similar abuses of power. Premier Financial Services issued a vague apology, though insiders whispered that the company was bracing for a wave of lawsuits from other victims emboldened by Eleanor's success. For Eleanor, life changed almost overnight. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her. Local activists invited her to speak at rallies. Even her boss at the law firm offered her a promotion, recognizing her potential as both a paralegal and a future attorney. But despite the newfound attention, Eleanor remained humble. She knew her fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. That evening, as she sat alone in her apartment reviewing the day's events, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the long nights spent poring over case files, the moments of self-doubt, and the countless times she had considered giving up. But most of all, she thought about the people who had inspired her, the ones who couldn't fight back but deserved justice all the same. With a satisfied smile, she closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for now, she savored the sweet taste of victory, knowing she had proven something invaluable, that even the quietest voices could shake the foundations of corruption if they dared to speak up. The weeks following Eleanor's courtroom victory were a whirlwind of activity, but they also marked the beginning of a profound transformation, not just for her, but for the community she had inadvertently inspired. News of her triumph spread, like wildfire, igniting conversations about justice, accountability, and the courage it takes to challenge powerful systems. What started as a personal battle against an unjust debt collection practice had evolved into something much larger, a movement that resonated with countless individuals who felt powerless in the face of corruption. Eleanor found herself at the center of this newfound attention, though she never sought the spotlight. Reporters continued to call her, asking for interviews and insights. Local activists invited her to speak at rallies and panel discussions, eager to hear from someone who had successfully taken on giants. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to step into such a public role. But as more people reached out, sharing their own stories of being mistreated by predatory companies or biased judges, she realized she couldn't stay silent. Her voice mattered now, not just for herself but for everyone who needed hope. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and media appearances, Eleanor sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. She flipped through the stack of letters she'd received over the past week, each one filled with gratitude and admiration. One letter stood out, a handwritten note from a young woman named Sarah, who wrote about how Eleanor's story had given her the courage to contest a wrongful eviction notice. "You showed me that even when the odds are stacked against us, we can still fight," Sarah had written. "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she read the words. For so long she had doubted whether her efforts would make a difference. Now, seeing the impact ripple outward, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about using her experience to help others navigate the same struggles she had faced. With that realization, Eleanor made a decision. She would pursue her dream of becoming a lawyer, channeling her passion for justice into a career dedicated to helping those without a voice. The very next morning, she enrolled in night classes at a nearby law school, balancing her studies with her job as a paralegal. It wouldn't be easy, juggling work, school, and the ongoing demands of her new public persona, but she was determined to see it through. Every late night spent studying case law and every early morning commute to class reminded her of why she was doing this: to create a world where no one had to feel powerless ever again. Meanwhile, the fallout from the courthouse scandal continued to unfold. Judge Richard Holloway became the subject of multiple investigations, both internal and external. His rulings in cases involving Premier Financial Services were scrutinized under a microscope, revealing a troubling pattern of bias and misconduct. While he initially tried to defend himself, claiming his decisions were based on sound legal reasoning, the mounting evidence painted a damning picture. Within months, he was suspended from the bench pending disciplinary action, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Premier Financial Services fared no better. Emboldened by Eleanor's success, dozens of other victims came forward with similar allegations, filing lawsuits and demanding restitution. The company's reputation plummeted, leading to boycotts and calls for stricter regulations on debt collection practices. Lawmakers seized the opportunity to introduce legislation aimed at protecting consumers from predatory tactics, citing Eleanor's case as a catalyst for change. By year's end, several states had passed new laws requiring greater transparency and accountability from financial institutions. For Eleanor, watching these changes unfold was both gratifying and humbling. She hadn't set out to spark a revolution. She simply wanted to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Yet in standing up for herself, she had inadvertently shone a light on systemic issues that affected thousands of people. That knowledge filled her with a deep sense of responsibility, one she embraced wholeheartedly. As time went on, Eleanor's life began to settle into a new rhythm. Balancing her studies, work, and advocacy efforts was challenging, but she thrived on the sense of purpose it gave her. Her colleagues at the law firm admired her dedication, often joking that she was destined to become a legal legend. Even her professors noticed her exceptional grasp of complex concepts, praising her ability to connect theory with real-world applications. Outside of academics, Eleanor continued to use her platform to advocate for justice. She partnered with local nonprofits to host workshops on consumer rights, teaching people how to recognize and combat unfair practices. She also collaborated with journalists to expose other instances of judicial misconduct, ensuring that stories like hers didn't go unnoticed. Each victory, no matter how small, reinforced her belief that individual actions could lead to collective change. By the time Eleanor graduated from law school 3 years later, she had become a household name, symbol of resilience and integrity in a system often criticized for its flaws. Her graduation ceremony was attended by friends, family, and strangers alike, many of whom had been touched by her journey. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the auditorium. It was a moment she would treasure forever, a testament to how far she had come. In her acceptance speech, delivered to a packed hall of graduates and guests, Eleanor reflected on everything she had learned along the way. "When I first stepped into that courtroom," she said, her voice steady and heartfelt, "I wasn't thinking about changing the world. I was just trying to protect myself. But I quickly realized that justice isn't something we achieve alone. It's something we build together. Every person who speaks up, every act of courage contributes to a bigger movement toward fairness and equality." She paused, scanning the crowd with a warm smile. "So to anyone out there who feels afraid to stand up for themselves, know this: your voice matters, your fight matters. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say enough to inspire others to do the same." The room erupted into applause once more, tears streaming down the faces of many in attendance. Eleanor returned to her seat, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. She knew her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Armed with her degree, her experiences, and an unshakable belief in the power of justice, she stepped boldly into the next chapter of her life. A chapter defined not by fear, but by hope. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would point to Eleanor Carter as a pivotal figure in the fight for accountability within the legal system. Her name would appear in textbooks, documentaries, and speeches about grassroots activism and the enduring human spirit. But to Eleanor, none of that mattered as much as the simple truth she had always known. That even the quietest voices, when raised with conviction, could shake the foundations of injustice and leave the world a little brighter than they found it.